Greetings and welcome back to an exceptionally special edition of Perspectives. I am here with the legendary and now infamous, teal deer, the one and only, the teal-colored deer that refutes feminists and is a man who goes with the data. And I am having him here today as a representative of the United Kingdom, specifically England, to talk about the country and the state of affairs there, because the UK has some fairly unique features, in particular with regards to Islam and radicalization. And I could think really of no other person who would be better to talk about it, because I imagine teal deer is relatively concerned. So the legendary teal deer, I'll let him take the floor now. Teal deer, thank you for being with me.
It's a pleasure to be here, as usual.
Yeah. As someone who's grown up in the UK, as someone who's kind of observed things, do you think there have been changes in the cultural makeup of the UK, say, in the past 10 years or so, or even 15?
Definitely. What we seem to be having at the moment in the UK is that there's a very distinct sort of cultural shift. We've moved a lot more towards the whole everything has to be accepted. Basically, it's something which I would imagine anyone in the Western world is familiar with to some degree. Britain is the country where we not all that long ago had the whole every child is special, everyone has to get a participation ribbon, and all of this sort of stuff. We started prioritizing people and saying, like, no, everyone has to feel special, everyone has to feel accepted, no one can ever be made to feel bad, no one ever has to accept basically when they fuck up or when they don't do something right, when they don't do something to the best of their ability. It doesn't matter because they tried, and that's what counts most. And this has sort of led on to quite an interesting state of affairs that we're having at the moment, where we are now in the UK very, very tolerant, I use that term loosely, of cultural shifts and cultural attitudes that do not actually seem to be of benefit to the nation as a whole. Dare I go down this collectivist route of saying, no, a nation needs to have a sort of set idea of what it wants to do and where it wants to go. But I think to some degree it does. And what we're seeing at the moment is not facilitating that.
Well, I would agree. I think a country, I'm by no means a nationalist, all my subs know that, needs an overarching set of principles. Otherwise, because ideally a country is going to unite people of many different ethnic backgrounds under a cultural and intellectual banner that they can commonly believe in, and that is then the guiding principle. When you don't have that, you seem to get a lot of chaos, and I think in the UK in particular, there's a lot of chaos, and specifically with regards to a delightful religion many of us are familiar with, called Islam. It seems to sort of be an issue, arguably more in the UK than some other parts of Europe. So maybe if you could tell us about that in relationship to the thing you just mentioned.
Yes. Islam is something that, well, controversial topic as it is something that's come up quite a lot in the UK. In regards to Islam, there's kind of two very distinct camps within it, as there seems to be again throughout most Western countries. There is the very moderate branch of people who kind of practice but don't necessarily adhere to everything, and they're the quite moderate ones, the people who will put, say, the law of the land ahead of their religion. They will respect local custom, respect local law, and integrate absolutely perfectly fine with the local populace, and they won't cause any problems. They're just people as far as everyone is concerned. They just go to a different building every once or twice a week, which in itself makes them a little bit unusual, as Britain is something, I think we have something like 70% of people who claim to be a religion on the census, but only actually about 20 or 30% of the population actually practice, or something ridiculous like that. So it's quite a quite an atheistic nation, but that's sort of besides the point. And then we have the other half of Islam, the absolute radicalized side, the people who take the absolute word of their religion as absolute truth, and local law, local custom be damned sort of thing. The sorts of people who want the sorts of people who claim that Sharia law is the way forward for the UK. We have regions in the UK now where there are unofficial Islamic courts which are set up and operated in so-called multi-faith centres, which is basically code in the UK for mosque. It's under the guise that anyone can use it, but in reality it's basically just a mosque, which you can occasionally rent out to have a party in or something like that, if you so choose. And these are the people who will actively attempt to disseminate quite extremist Islamic doctrine. What we have in certain areas, there's quite a few areas, places like Birmingham, which was quite a famous area for having the Muslim rape gangs. There was another one, I can't remember, what was the name of it? I think it started with an R. You remember that off the top of your head?
Rotherham.
That was the one.
Yeah.
And another area in East London, which some of your listeners may also remember or know of for some recent events, called Leighton and Leytonstone. They're two areas which are basically right next to each other. These are areas where we are seeing the extremist element of Islam really going all out into the public domain, quite shamelessly, regardless of actual, not only just local custom, but also actual local law. There are areas in some of those places where you will see small yellow signs which have gone around and been placed on lampposts and on walls, simply declaring that this area is a Sharia law zone. You are not allowed to drink there. You are not allowed to listen to music in public there. So you can't do the thing that people do where they sometimes walk around with music coming out of their phones, which personally I'm okay with people not doing that because I find it really annoying, but people still have the right to do it. I might not like it, but I'm not going to tell them not to, but these people will. Women are not allowed to dress promiscuously in those areas, and you're not allowed to drink in those areas as well. Now, the UK does have certain legal areas where you're not allowed to consume alcohol outside. Totally fine with that. You tend to have to get a license to do that, which is why pubs have areas out the front which are often separated from the street with railings where you can sit outside at tables and drink out the front. And these areas are policed unofficially, a lot of the time, by Islamic gangs. These are women who, if you break any of these laws that they have just decided that these areas now operate under, they will just walk up to you and they will tell you to leave. If you don't, they will tell you to leave. If you don't, they will make you leave. And you have no real rebuttal to this, because these are areas where the police, like the actual British police force, who are supposed to be upholding the actual laws of the country, will in some cases not intervene because they have fear of being labelled as racist. Because as soon as the racist word gets uttered at them, that's it. The entire event becomes paralysed, it becomes a media circus, and then all sorts of investigative probes get released into the police force to try and demonstrate how racist they are or how not racist they are, and it's bizarre, and I have yet to see anyone who has actually conclusively demonstrated for me what race Islam is, but that's a whole issue for a whole other time. And I even have personal experience of this because I do happen to live reasonably close to one of these very Islamized areas. And it was a time when I drove into a public car park. And I thought, well, it's a public car park, I can go there, it's not a problem. Pulled into it. As I was stopping at the barrier, car was instantly surrounded by about a dozen Muslim men who asked me why I was there. I said, well, it's a car park, I'm going to park my car. But how can I say this without sounding like a real sarcastic dick? But that is kind of a statement of the obvious. And then I was informed in no uncertain terms that this was a car park for the mosque across the road. So I said, well, is there a sign for that? Is this actually private property owned by the mosque? You know, have I actually just made a mistake? Was there a sign that I missed? And they just said, no, it's just a car park used by the mosque on this day, at this time. If you're not going to the mosque, you can't be here. Unsurprisingly, because there was about a dozen of them and only one of me, I didn't really want to stick around. Nor did I want to justify it and leave the car there, because probably wouldn't have been there when I got back.
Right.
So this is the sort of thing that is happening.
So these guys, I'll call them thugs because that's what they were, did they look like the sort of traditional giant long beard, or did they look like normal people?
A little bit of both. You sort of have the styles of dress obviously associated with Islam that we see in the people who really sort of follow it to the letter. You know, some will wear the I can't remember the name of them, the sort of very long shirts that basically go down to the knee or belong, and the hat as well, which
right.
Again, I feel really bad for not knowing the names of any of these things.
No, who cares?
Yeah, I don't really care that much, but I probably should, but who cares? So there was kind of a mixture of that. Some were, some weren't, but they are the sort of... They all would have one element of this, either sort of the very large beard, the hat, or this particular shirt style. So yeah, they are definitely on the very strict end.
And would you say that encountering these kinds of thugs, I mean, this is, it's not terribly uncommon. I mean, you're not the first person I've heard talk about so-called Sharia areas, you know, like designated grounds where so-called Sharia law, and apparently even sort of de facto courts. So I've heard these, and maybe you confirm them or not, and I've seen reports that within certain Muslim communities there's a problem that needs to get sorted out, and so they say, well, we're going to go to the local Sharia judge, often involves a marriage or some similar incident thing, and that's where it gets kind of sorted, basically. Is that actually true?
Yes, this is something which does happen. There are Sharia courts available in the UK. They tend to be held in mosques or, again, in these multi-faith centres.
How do they operate? Is this, I mean, because let's say you're having marital problems, which is something that you and I wouldn't suffer from, but you could see a marriage counselor, I think a psychiatrist or a psychologist. Is that how is that what they call it? It's sort of like counseling, or do they actually say, no, we're sort of legally in some sort of Islamic jurisprudence sense going to weigh in on this?
Well, this is the thing. They are kept very quiet. If you know where they are, you can find them. Generally, they do operate within mosque hours, but they're the sorts of things which are held in back rooms, or they're the sorts of things that if you happen to know your preachers, you can just arrange something.
Right.
It's the sort of thing that, there's not going to be a signpost for it, but you can definitely find them. It's the sort of thing that is spread very much by word of mouth.
It's interesting. You had mentioned moderates, and I'm not the one who's pointed this out. I think it was Sam Harris, who I'm sure you're familiar with at least partially, who's pointed this out, that yes, there are many, indeed perhaps majority of Muslims are quote-unquote moderates, but they're still Muslims. And so when something bad happens, I mean, you're lucky, you were smart, you avoided this confrontation with these thugs. But they all they end up saying is, well, that's not my Islam, or don't generalize. Instead of actually saying, here, yes, we're moderate Muslims, and there are certain elements within the Quran, within Islam, that are toxic and very dangerous to the cohesion of Western society, and we need to address it, and we as Muslims in particular need to address it. And that's not something I just don't hear it from Muslims at all. I mentioned privately before Majid Nawaz, who is a so-called Muslim reformer. I think he's a closet atheist, but he calls himself a Muslim, so we'll call him a Muslim. And he was he was visiting Australia, and he was at a sort of a round desk and people talking. And the woman, a quote-unquote moderate Muslim who was there, I think she emigrated from some Arab country, said, you're saying you're here talking about how great secular values are, and why do I need to think that's great? I mean, why is that necessarily the best thing? And then a journalist, an Australian journalist, not a Muslim, weighed and said, well, if you're going to live in Australia, yes, you need to believe in secular values. And this is a concern I have, that yes, they don't break the law, they don't engage in hoodlumism as these thugs did, but they're also not particularly good proponents of upholding some of the principles that are necessary to have a cohesive Western society. And they're also not particularly good about criticizing the aspects of Islam which are absolutely present, because you just described a story that it's not the first time I've heard things like that. I think the moderate Muslim community needs to do a lot more, not just we non-Muslims, in criticizing this stuff. I mean, I'm curious, have you ever had a conversation where you might have told that story to a moderate Muslim acquaintance and they actually said, oh, that's horrible, or anything along those lines?
Yeah, I have had this. I recall actually talking to a Muslim guy that I know now. While he was practicing, he actually lives in West London on the other side. So he's in sort of one of the more moderate areas in general. East London is very much where the more extremist side is. And to give you an example of two of the more extreme things which have happened in East London, which actually not very far away from where I currently am, that have sort of been covered up nationally and almost certainly covered up internationally, was an instance a couple of months ago where a man was stabbed on the London Underground under the cry of "This is for Syria" by a Muslim. And then the most extreme example was actually a man who was attacked and beheaded within a mosque because his beard was too short, and that was somehow an affront to Allah or something. That was hushed up very, very quickly, because it inevitably would have reflected very poorly on Islam. And when you tell these sorts of stories to moderate Muslims, it is the denial. It's the, well, that's not Islam. But, and this is something which I think a lot of people really need to come to terms with and really need to realize. Islam is not just a religion. And this is something which I think a lot of people miss. Islam, while it has spiritual elements, and obviously we're talking about Islam here, the very Middle Eastern Islam. We're not talking necessarily about the African branches of Islam, which are actually quite peaceful. Their entire idea of ideology is, sitting around being nice to each other, singing songs, trying to get closer to Allah. They're not violent, they don't have the Sharia law or anything like that. The sorts of Islam...
Possibly with the exception of Boko Haram, but yeah.
Yeah, but there's a lot, this is something which I think people, again, also need to recognize, that there's large areas of Islam that the aim is just to get closer to God. They don't actually give a damn about, Sharia law. They don't care about all of this stuff. It's not part of what it is. They don't necessarily view Muhammad as, the perfect man. What we have in this country is the Middle Eastern branch, the branch which does consider Muhammad to be the perfect guy. Sharia law is the only way. And this is the thing which people need to realize. Islam is not just a religion in this regard. It has within it, built into it, a series of codes of conduct by which to run and by which to build and by which to maintain a society. It is the only religion that we have at the moment that really has within it this idea that laws must be changed because there is an objective, correct way that society must be governed in order for this religion to be integrated with it perfectly. And that, I think, is one of the biggest problems with it, because this is what leads to this culture clash, whereby, and it was actually polled not very long ago, by the UK government, and it was something like 2/3 of Muslims, even if they don't actively go out and try to enforce Sharia law, still want it in the UK. So that's a majority.
And Teal, dear, this is my great concern, that so many of these moderate Muslims, yeah, they don't commit crimes, they're not going to assault you and go thug on you, but they're extremely passive, and they're not, for example, I would say, passionate political philosophers for secularism and freedom of speech. I mean, I have this feeling that, yeah, if Sharia law hit the UK, countrywide, they probably would just go along with it and not be too unhappy about it. I don't see them, dying for the sake of liberty. I don't see them as being sort of patriots in some sense. They're very, very passive in my experience. And I think, frankly speaking, when you say, well, that's not my Islam, that doesn't help. So what? It's not your Islam. It's still happening. Someone is still getting murdered, or someone's still being accosted by a bunch of thugs. You telling us that that's not your Islam, well, why don't you go to those guys and say, that's not the way Islam is supposed to be? And most of the time, these moderates just end up arguing with secular people like us instead of the actual radicals and thugs who almost assaulted you,
Yeah. That is sort of one of the big concerns here. The moderate people within Islam, it's the sort of thing, they are still interested in Islam perpetuating itself in its current form because they think their interpretation is the correct way. And as a result of that, they are more inclined to pick a fight with someone, say, like myself or yourself, who are more along the lines of either you can have your religion but just don't force it on other people, or maybe someone more like myself who's like, I would just rather your religion cease to exist along with all religion.
Oh, look, if it were, I mean, this is just my personal view. I don't like Islam. I've said this before. I have no problem admitting it. And I don't like mosques being erected in places that culturally really had no precedent for it, and it amounts to hypocrisy on the part of a lot of Muslim organizations. There's no Christian organization that could just land in the middle of Iran or Saudi Arabia saying, I'm going to build a church, and yet you have Pakistani organizations funding mosques in far-flung places of Ireland, which it's just absolutely insane. Aesthetically, I think it's unpleasing, but yeah, I mean, I don't like Islam. I'm the first one to admit it. And the reasons why I don't like it is because I think ultimately it has its roots in imperialism and dogmatism. And it's not just about leaving you alone. I mean, we're not talking about the Amish here or Quakers. They really want the world to even if you're a moderate, most moderates think you'd be better off being a Muslim than being a secular atheist or whatever. And that's a very disturbing thought, because the moderates might not point a knife at you or a gun at you, but the fact that they think you'd be better off adhering to some interpretation of Islam is quite disturbing in of itself. So if I could snap my fingers and get rid of Islam, which I think is one of the greatest mind viruses ever created, I would. Probably before anything else, frankly speaking.
Yeah, that is very much sort of my opinion on it as well. I mean, I have no love of religion in general, but I do have quite a special place in my heart for destruction of Islam. It's like, if the religions had to go in an order, you're number one.
Yeah, because, I mean, there are all kinds of wacky religion. I mean, Sam Harris always brings up the Jainism, where you're so afraid to hurt living creatures that you wear cloth over your mouth so you don't inhale some arthropod or something like that. That's a bit wacky, and it would prevent you from getting things done, but obviously a person who's vowed to not hurt living organisms is not going to hurt a human being. This is not the case with Islam. And I mean, I find myself, I said this in a live stream with Sargon the other night on it was a bunch of people. I said, I find myself really being tested in my limits on, say, belief in freedom of religion and expression because, I mean, Islam doesn't give a shit about that. And I think there was even a show in the UK where the big I think it was, is it called The Big Question? You have a Scottish guy who's, you might know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it's generally a shit show.
Yeah. Should we be tolerant of the intolerant? And generally speaking, I think absolutely. But, then you just get in a practical situation like the thugs who tried to, basically evicted you from the car park. And I just think, I'm just really torn on this issue. I mean, personally, I dislike Islam. I dislike looking at mosques being built in historically, culturally. Not even, I'm not a Christian, I'm an atheist, but, in the middle of some nice, quaint Irish town, they're building a freaking mosque sponsored by some Pakistani rich dude. And I'm just thinking, what on earth is going on here? I don't really know how to deal with this because the principles of freedom of expression and religion, Muslims don't care about that in general, vast majority in my experience, and listening to them in the media and so on and so forth. And yet, I find myself kind of philosophically obligated to uphold them, but that's, they take advantage of it, and it's ultimately to our detriment on some level,
Yeah, I think that's pretty much covered my thoughts on it as well.
I'm torn, so you feel torn as well.
Yeah, it's like I said, if I could, I would just get rid of it. But then I do have the slight libertarian bent of my mind that says, well, no, people do have and should have a right to worship whatever ridiculous sky creature they want to, in whatever way they please, as long as they don't harm other people. But when you have built into that, as I said before, they have this sect of Islam which is ever growing, that the UK is being forced to be tolerant of. Absolutely forced to. You're not allowed to say anything about this because then you're racist somehow. It does work to the detriment of the society around you because it is a specific branch of Islam that is actively encouraging social division because it goes against all principles that we actually have within the Western world. It is a regressive part of Islam that does have this mentality of, no, people should not have equal opportunity to achieve. Women do have their place in the home. Men do have their place in supporting them, regardless. It's that very extreme, first of all, oppression towards women, which is not a phrase I find myself saying in sincerity very often, but also the extreme gynocentrism of that.
Right. And the fact that as a male you're obligated to do all kinds of things for her sake as well.
Yeah, it's like, your woman is not allowed to do this, but you must pay for her to do anything. If she has a job, that money's hers, and she doesn't have to spend it on you, but you must spend your money on her. And if she's not allowed to drive anywhere, you will chauffeur her around. You will follow her around in public places to make sure nothing bad happens to her.
Yeah, and I think this is something that people get wrong very often. Islam, it's not, people think it's, great for men. No, it's not. It's just showering you with a bunch of obligations that you perhaps don't want to have. And especially if you're a MGTOW-minded man, why on earth would you want to have those obligations if you're not interested in marriage and partnership? So often Islam is pointed out, and I guess it's useful as a true tool of rhetoric in the media, that it's solely about the oppression of women or something like that. But nobody really has a good time under Islam. As long as you value personal freedom, nobody really has a good time. And let's talk about some of the reactions. I mean, things like, you've heard of Tommy Robinson, I imagine.
The name sounds kind of familiar, but not immediately.
He was at various times involved in the English Defense League, and he's very outspoken against Islam, and they paint him as a racist. They've thrown him in jail and all sorts of things. I don't really think most of the depictions are accurate, but I'm afraid in the UK as elsewhere that the reaction to Islam, or political Islam, if you want to be more accurate, you don't really see any mainstream opposition to it unless you get things like, I don't know, the BNP or various. I have this bad feeling that, and this is, I guess, a somewhat separate factor, the mass immigration, but it's all sort of related, that inevitably the horrible result of this will be a legitimate rise in fascism, legitimate fascism, like old school fascism. And I don't see any way of avoiding it, because moderates, Muslims, don't talk about it really. I mean, they claim they do, but not really. When bad shit happens, they say, when it was November 11th, whenever that happened, oh, don't say bad things about Islam. First thing they do. Douglas Murray, maybe. He's a very outspoken columnist and writer and commentator. Al Jazeera had him on. They say the first thing the guy asks him, so what do you think, after all these people have been gunned down, what do you think the reputation of Muslims is going to be like in Europe? And he just shot him down for it, rather than drawing attention to what actually happened. But without any legitimate resistance, and the inability to provide resistance because everyone's afraid of being called a racist, and once again, Islam is not a race. You can be an Irish-Scottish white dude with a big ugly red beard and still be a Muslim fanatic.
One of our poster boys that we actually have in East London for Islam, I can't remember his name, he is actually very ginger. Very pale, very ginger. You've probably seen him in newspapers.
Yeah. So that's just a tool of deflection, and you see it very often used. But the response to this really is that mainstream political parties, conservative, labor, they don't really talk about it. Then you get things like the English Defence League, which is kind of really polarized. Some people say they're racist, maybe they are. And I mean BNP, which is legitimately, I think, probably sort of a white nationalist style party. And UKIP. Okay, so moving slightly to political, I like UKIP. I'm not English, but I like UKIP, and I generally like what Nigel Farage has to say. What are your thoughts on UKIP and in that regard, the future of the UK then?
Well, actually, I'm going to go on a tangent before I answer this question. It's not me dodging it, so feel free to bring me back to this.
Please.
If I find myself completely lost. There's an interesting political shift that's happened recently in the UK between... I don't like the whole left-right paradigm. I find it to be very limiting. I don't find it to be very useful to get into all the details of politics. But there's something very interesting that's happened. Now, in the UK, we've traditionally had a very three-party system. This might sound a little weird for people in America who, for them, it's Democrat or Republican, that's it. In the UK, we have three major political parties. We have the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, and the Liberal Democrat Party. The Conservative are pseudo-right-leaning, the Labour is pseudo-left-leaning, semi-socialist, and the Lib Dems are kind of shit and useless and somewhere in the middle, like never really do anything. These are the three sort of big contending parties. Now, over the years, they've basically become more or less one party. There's not a whole lot of difference between them. There's a few issues on which they differ. Labour does still lean more towards the socialist working side. Lib Dems are still the fucking useless middleman, and the Conservative Party is a bit more... They're not conservative in sort of a more traditional sense. They're more of a corporatist party these days. They're not sort of on the right wing in the whole, we demand freedoms of individuals to express things. They're more leaning towards, we want companies to do everything because we love their money and they give us lots of it. And what's quite interesting is the voter pattern in the UK. The cities, which have very large immigrant populations in the UK, favour the Labour Party massively. The reason being, obviously, being a more socialist-leaning party, they're very big on their welfare checks. They love the forced redistribution of wealth. And the Conservative Party, which is a bit more corporatist and a little bit more traditional in its values, is a lot more popular in more rural areas that aren't affected by this immigration, because people in those areas stand to benefit from not having their money taken away and given to poor people living in cities, fairly obviously. And Liberal Democrats are still the useless shit people in the middle. I'm never going to get away from describing them as that. They've never really done anything.
Yeah, I followed for a while, yeah. They seem that way.
Yeah. Now, what's quite interesting is over the last decade, we have seen in Scotland, and this is something which I would imagine has had some fair international coverage, because it is quite a big event. Scotland has seen a rise in the Scottish Nationalist Party, which, even though it describes itself as a nationalist party, being very much that it's very concerned about the welfare of Scotland, it's still quite a socialist party. Obviously, not to be confused with National Socialist Party. Just because those two words exist.
Can I just briefly interrupt?
Yeah, sure.
I think you're striking an important vein here. I've said this in previous videos. Many of these nationalist parties, if you look at their economic policies, they're completely socialist. They're not talking about, limited government and lower taxes and personal responsibility. They're just kind of, I like my country and we need to give welfare, but let's keep it away from the immigrants.
Yeah. That's basically what the SNP is going for. Now, what's quite interesting is because the SNP is kind of left-leaning, despite having the word national in its title because reasons, what's happened is they've become very popular. And a large amount of Labour support comes from Scotland, because Scotland is fairly left-leaning, fairly socialist overall. And something quite interesting has happened as a result of the rise of the SNP. If the SNP stay popular, basically what they've done is they've split the more left-leaning, more socialist side of politics between the Labour Party and the Scottish Nationalist Party. What this, in essence, means is that Labour are effectively out of the running because half of their supporters have fucked off to join the SNP. So the Liberal Democrats, being a shit party in the middle that no one gives a fuck about, have never really been a contester for anything. Pretty much any time. I think the last time they had a full government to themselves was decades ago. Any time otherwise, they've had to share leadership with someone else. Most recently, obviously, with the Conservative Party. So, because of the rise of the SNP, what's happened is, in essence, we're now in a situation in Britain where it's going to be almost impossible to have a left-wing government, because the Conservative Party is basically going to win all the time, because the left side, and calling Conservative right and Labour left is kind of bullshit. It's like they're as close to each other as the fingers on one hand, as opposed to, if you had your right hand is the right wing, the left hand is the left, The Labour Party is your left eye and the Conservative Party is the right. They're that close together, there's basically no difference. But that's something quite interesting that's happened lately. So we're basically in this position where we're going to be stuck, almost certainly, with this very marginally right-leaning corporatist party who's probably going to win all the time, because the left wing is now divided very heavily between SNP and Labour because of the voting patterns. And now I'm going to get back to UKIP. UKIP is quite interesting in this regard. They are a bit more right-wing than the Conservative Party in that they are looking for a bit more limited government, harsher controls on immigration. You're only getting put into the country of the shit that we saw, the unemployment problem, which the UK still has. I mean, we still have however many million people out of work because there's just not enough jobs for the population that we have. So bringing more people in is only going to exacerbate that and drive wages even further down, which is why, obviously, there's more legislation afoot to try and increase the minimum wage. But that doesn't matter. If you're an illegal immigrant coming into this country, minimum wage doesn't apply to you. And people can and will exploit that. And UKIP are offering kind of an alternative to that. And they are effectively doing what the main three parties will not do. They are speaking about needing immigration control. They are talking about removing the UK from the EU.
European Union.
Yeah.
Mm.
And this, as far as I'm aware, is something that's also happening in places like Germany, being one of the major contributors to the EU. Basically, every single time the EU has a whip round, the money comes out of places like Germany and Britain, and there's basically nothing that ever comes back. There's very little comeback. Yeah, there's a slight trade benefit, but it's nothing that really seems to happen that you couldn't establish anyway, like as an independent nation.
Yeah, I mean, regarding the EU, I used to be at least in favor of labor mobility because I personally benefit from it, the ability to move to different countries. But increasingly, I think it's been a failed experiment, and a lot of these immigration policies stem partly from this idea that, open borders. That meant in the context of Europe. We didn't talk about open borders with Turkey and North Africa and Syria.
And this is why there was a big push to get Turkey into the EU, I think.
Oh, gods. Yeah, that would be a nightmare.
I believe, wasn't it successful? Isn't Turkey actually in the EU now? Or are they still under,
They are absolutely not, to the best of my knowledge, not in the EU. There is a push for Ukraine to become part of it. That's not a particularly smart idea. It's a mess. So I think overall it's been a fairly failed experiment, but I don't think the politicians have the political backbone, apart from maybe Nigel Farage, to just follow through. Because if the UK actually left the EU, and there are political processes that allow for that, I think a lot of other countries would follow suit. I mean, it's kind of unfortunate because I think it might have worked on some level, but the recent immigration crisis, the Greek debt crisis, which is ongoing, it's been a nightmare. I think we need to go to like 1987 Europe or something like that, because the other thing is that once you dissolve the EU, each country can do whatever immigration border control thing they want to do. There's not going to be an issue. So, Hungary is which I'm a citizen of, is chastised for erecting a fence and not letting anyone in, and they need to do their fair share. Okay, but if you're outside of the EU, it doesn't really matter. And the UK being outside of the EU could control immigration, and I'd argue that they could probably, frankly speaking, get rid of people like the thugs who accosted you in the parking, the car park. So I'm all for not only the UK leaving the EU, just everyone. Even though I'd lose my ability to just live anywhere I wanted, I think it's a sacrifice worth making because the EU has been overall an unmitigated disaster for the common European person, I'd say. Even though in some ways we benefited from the mobility aspect, but the loss of border control and the uncontrolled immigration is kind of that nail that is being driven home, and it's going to nail the coffin shut. And I mean, although to be fair, I am skeptical. I think you're going to have a referendum next year, right?
I think so. Yeah, it was either this
year. If that
year
happens,
or next.
I doubt you're going to get a majority. Well, who knows? And the other thing, historically,
well, the thing is, it's a referendum. That just means people vote for their opinion. The government doesn't have to listen.
Right.
Odds are they won't.
And furthermore, there have been tons of referendums in the past where, places like the Netherlands, France, Ireland rejecting the EU constitution, and they shove it down their throats anyway. So, I mean, I don't know a particularly peaceful way to leave the EU, but I would imagine if there's enough public pressure in the UK from people who support UKIP and so on and so forth, you definitely could get there, because then politicians at the end of the day want to save their hides and keep their offices. I don't think they represent principles so much as their own interests. And if the majority of the population says, we're tired of this, they're going to have to listen. Merkel, the chancellor, I saw an article today, she's fighting for her political life right now because of really shitty decisions she made for the whole of Germany. The only concern I'd have is, as you pointed out, the immigration population in the UK and the Muslim population in the UK, they're never going to vote for UKIP. They like the benefits, as you pointed out, and they want a policy that allows anyone from anywhere to go in there, particularly if they're of the Muslim faith. I hate to say it, but there seems to be a legitimate clash of civilizations going on here.
Absolutely. This is the big problem that we're having at the moment. And this is sort of one of the issues, again, which I see, and it's coming from the sort of progressive side who are trying to paint any opposition to this as a race issue. And it's not. It is not a race issue. It's not that these European nations, and Britain specifically, to actually stay on topic, it's not that, like, Britain and Europe hate people who aren't white. Not at all. The problem is when there is a culture coming in that is completely counter to what is already here. People are more than welcome to enter European countries if they are willing to actually join in with local custom, with local law. That's then not a problem. The problem is when you come in and attempt to usurp that. And one of the big issues that we're seeing at the moment is, of course, the economic tourism that does happen now.
Well, Teal, do you know what I call it? I call it welfare tourism.
Yeah, that's what it is. People come in, and we've seen it. It's something that people like to, well, again, the progressive side like to downplay. They say, "Oh no, this is only a minority. It's a very small number. Look at this crying woman carrying her child." While they ignore the fact that 70 or 80% of these migrants are men between the ages of 18 and 30. You know, so no, these people are here to...
The evidence for this, I pointed this out, I think it was in a video a while back. So Denmark, I think it was in September, October, had passed some legislation limiting the allocation of welfare resources, and particularly to immigrant populations. And as a response, they actually just got up and left. They went to Sweden, some of them said, well, we're going to the UK because some relative of mine said the benefits are better there, so let's just head over there. I think, interestingly enough, and I'm getting a bit off topic, that as someone who doesn't think a massive welfare system is ideal, this is actually showing the cracks in the system, that it has limitations, and the very fact that there is a very robust welfare system in most European states, particularly in the continent, makes it a prime point or destination of attraction to these welfare immigrants. I mean, you see, a lot of people aren't willing to go. I mean, you don't get the same mass immigration to other countries such as the States because the welfare isn't as robust, or to Eastern European countries, and there are other reasons for that. A lot of them are xenophobic, frankly speaking, which is, that's a different topic. But yeah, they don't have the best welfare system. Where they go to places like Germany, Denmark, Sweden, the UK, and I'm wondering long term, I'm sort of just hypothesizing or theorizing that maybe in the long term, this is ultimately going to just sort of shatter the entire welfare project in Europe. A bit off topic, but because it's just not going to be able to handle the weight of everyone trying to get benefits without necessarily paying into it in a corresponding fashion.
Yeah, this is something, and I think people, again, aren't necessarily realizing this. There is a limit to how much wealth you can forcefully redistribute from people.
Yeah.
And that is what this welfare system is. Now, welfare is not something that I'm inherently opposed to. I think it absolutely does have its place within a society. It's certainly a sacrifice that I personally am willing to make. I don't mind if a small amount of my money goes to help other people who need it. This is why I'm totally okay with the existence of, say, the NHS and nationalized fire services and police forces. I don't object to paying for those things. I hope that I never have to use them, but I'm happy that they're there for me if I do need them, and if someone else uses them in the meantime, great. I'm all for that. I don't see a downside to that. But when these things go towards disproportionately helping certain groups within society who have no actual interest in paying into them, and who intentionally go out of their way to not pay into them, that then becomes a problem, because it becomes an economic strain. Because what we have at the moment is the obvious demographic which we've covered and has been repeatedly publicized and repeatedly accused of being racist or some such nonsense. most of the immigrants that we see are men of working age. They come to European countries, Britain specifically in this instance. When they do work, they get cash-in-hand work, which is often below minimum wage, because they can't necessarily take legal jobs.
And thus not taxable.
And thus not taxable, yeah. They will happily use public services, which are then funded by people who are being taxed, and some of their money will go overseas, which then weakens the economy of the country that they're in. And these migrants, because large numbers of them are very questionable in origin, and they do not want to be found, what we have seen, and I'm sure this is the case again for European countries, we have in this country a cottage industry called the shed with a bed, which, I don't know if you're familiar with that phrase or something like that?
I'm actually not. Maybe you can tell us about it.
Bed with a shed, or shed with a bed, is basically an illegal housing racket, which is run in the UK, and we have basically houses which are built, or they have sheds, like external, like garden sheds. Some of them can be wood, or they can be concrete buildings. And landlords will illegally furnish them with like a fridge, a cooker or a hot plate, a bed, a shower, and a toilet, and they'll rent them out to people. And these things can go for, it's really depressing, actually, like basically a one-bedroom studio flat, which is what it in essence is. Your kitchen and living room is one, and in some cases the toilet and shower is in the same room. It's just in a corner somewhere with some tiles on the floor. These things can be rented out for £700 or £800 a calendar month, in some cases up to £1,000 a calendar month. And they are there, off the books, they're unregistered housing. The housing officials that we have in this country are constantly finding these things and closing them down, because it's illegal housing, and these are here specifically to house these immigrant workers, these low-paid, off-the-book people. And it's really shocking, the number of these things that are found and have to be closed down. And it was actually perfect. I was watching a TV show a couple of days ago. I love how I can't remember the names of these things. It was something about housing officers, and they actually went into a standard terraced house, which we have quite a lot of in this country. And someone had converted it into two flats, top and bottom, across the two floors, which is illegal. It's against the housing regulation for those things. So they went in. The landlord was nowhere to be found, couldn't be contacted or anything like that. There was the manager of the building, who was also a resident, who was obviously a Middle Eastern man. Can't help but think he might have been the property owner as well under a different name, because they were never able to locate the actual property owner. So they got the building back up to code, and then just looking out the back window, they noticed there was the shed, had curtains up in the window, drawn. And they were like, so we've corrected the building and got that back up to code. Let's go have a look around there. They converted the garage into one of these sheds with a bed, because they couldn't afford the income. So basically, you took one house, which financially you might have been able to rent out for somewhere between $1,000 and $1,200 a month, because rent rates in London are fucking extortionate, and they basically turned it into 3 bedrooms, going for $800 to $1,000 each, in essence tripling their money illegally, all to house these illegal immigrants who are coming in and then working underpaid and being absolutely exploited in every way. And this is another reason why I don't like this open borders policy. Partly because it becomes a drain on the economy like that, because everything is then done off the books, but also because the people who come in like that, they don't want to be found, and as a result, they are horrendously exploited in situations like this as well. So everyone loses.
Yeah, clearly you're saying this because you're a racist.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I am saying this because I hate the brown people, because I'm concerned about the conditions that they are then able to be forced to live in.
Pretty clear example.
Yeah. But that's the sort of response that I will get. It's like, I will say, look, I oppose unlimited immigration because the people who come here who don't want to be found because of this end up being treated like shit. Oh, well, you're racist. Clearly. My concern about how people are exploited means I hate them.
This is the kind of like swamp you have to wade through in order to get some common sense across these days. The politics of our day is just so entrenched with rank nonsense and sort of single word accusations that can shut down an entire conversation, and in some cases ruin your career and your livelihood and other things that I have absolutely no hope. I mean, I'm having this conversation. I think it's important. I think it's important we talk about it, but how on earth can we change things? Because we are getting to the point, and maybe it won't happen tomorrow, maybe it'll take 10 years, but the only thing that's going to be left to be done is something very drastic. I mean, I've noticed, not just on my channel, but a lot of channels, a lot of guys who, they're just, normal people that, but they feel like the only thing they can rely on are these parties that tend to be sort of racially motivated and nationally oriented and all this other stuff, because that's the only thing left. Because nobody is talking any just common sense, and because to say that you want immigration controls and greater restrictions just paints you as some sort of devil, and it's pushing people into a corner they don't want to be in. Not really, but they're just thinking, where else can I go? And this will continue and get worse and worse and worse because there's just no common sense. And eventually, I fear, it's going to turn to violence. We talked about Calais before. Calais is, for those who don't know, especially for the Australians who tend to be really bad at geography, no offense, that's historically an important small city in France. And you listen and see some of the stories coming out, it sounds like a war zone. And unfortunately, this seems like it could be a model for some other city or several other cities in Europe, given the requisite numbers of immigrants and what have you. And your view, and I share it largely, is a minority view, and I just don't know how we can practically tackle this without sort of brass tacks honesty about certain things, honesty about the nature of Islam, honesty about the nature of welfare tourism, the fact that a lot of these guys are just going there to mooch off the system, honesty about the conditions, as you mentioned, for the immigrant. I mean, how can we talk about any of this? I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm just being overly pessimistic here, but you probably experienced that every conversation you've had with particularly people on the left gets shut down by words. And I've noticed this before. I made a video about this. We all find ourselves qualifying our statements. I'm not a racist, but we exist now in an atmosphere of such paranoia that everything we have to say has to be qualified to somehow deflect the notion that we're not this. Sargon does this quite frequently, in fact. I'm just not very hopeful. I hate being so pessimistic, but everything you said makes perfect sense to me. But that's a minority view, actually.
Yeah, it's a minority view to think that, well, if we had controlled immigration and we knew where these people were going, first of all, they could actually pay into the system that they're here to support. Well, first of all, we could make sure they actually want to integrate into the society that they're joining, which I've said before and I will say again, culture is the most important aspect of any country. You don't have to be absolutely in lockstep with each other, but if everyone's kind of going in the same direction, that's way better than massive divergency, and it's necessary. But if we control immigration, we can know that people want to be here. We can know the reasons why. We can keep track of them. They can actually contribute to society. And if society does make the sacrifice of welfare, and that's what I consider welfare to be, it is a sacrifice of society to help someone. It shouldn't be viewed as a means of life. It's not like you need to be shamed for taking it, but you need to accept that other people are sacrificing their time and their effort for you. And then we can make sure that these people who come here, who do have to go on this welfare, who do have to take this sacrifice from society, that they can repay it, and they can repay it in a way where they are not then being exploited for the financial gain of someone else.
Right.
And how can that be a minority view? Everyone wins if we do that.
At least partially, that in my experience, I've looked at polls, and particularly in the UK, and it's true of other countries, but especially in the UK, a lot of British Muslims, they don't see themselves as British or English. They see themselves as Muslims that happen to live in the UK. Personally speaking, I think, and let's call it tyrannical view, that people of religious persuasion, we don't need to single out Muslims, should be asked the question, point blank, do you think the laws of the land, do you think the secular structures of the land are more important than your religion? And depending on the answer, you can react a certain way. If a Muslim person, no, I think the Quran is more important, I think Sharia is more important, frankly speaking, whether he's born in the UK or not, that person has absolutely no place in British society or any other European society for that matter, because that view is just not compatible with the kind of society we want to maintain and have progress into the future. That's my view. It's extremist, I imagine, but people who prioritize their religion over the secular, you can have your freedom of religion, but ultimately you bow down to the same laws of the land that the rest of us do, whether we believe or not. And if you don't think that, you have no place in the society. And honestly, I think you should probably leave, ideally.
Yeah. No, that is pretty much my opinion of it as well. If you go to a country, you integrate with that country. It is as simple as that. You have made the choice to go there. If you have made that choice, then you have to stand by that choice and everything that entails. By all means, when you get there, you can take part in whatever democratic process that country has if you feel like something does need to be changed. By all means, once you're a citizen of that country and you have integrated, then you have just as much right to use your political voice and political sway as much as anyone else. But that then assumes that democracy actually works and you support the democracy of that country, and that's a whole other thing. I personally think democracy is fucking bankrupt in Europe, but
absolutely,
it's ridiculous. Well, personally, I'm not a fan of democracy anyway. I think democracy is somewhat a fraudulent view, but maybe that's just me.
I think, I mean, without going too off topic, that was the original idea behind the United States. That sort of it was republicanism, which is distinct. In Switzerland, you have direct democracy, which seems to be a better way of doing things. But yeah, I think more specifically, I would say representative democracy is a joke and doesn't work very well.
Yeah, if you're going to go democracy, you need direct democracy where everyone's voice is equal, or you need something meritocratic. This halfway house between pseudo merit and semi-democracy, where it's all representative of. It's like I have to pick the person who I find least objectionable. Basically, it's ridiculous.
Exactly.
It's a mockery of democracy.
In the States, in particular, I've always joked about the parties. I say, well, it's basically two piles of shit. One is maybe diarrhea smeared and smells worse. You got to go for the less smelly pile of shit. Basically, it's absolutely horrendous. I would be in favor of direct democracy, because by that I mean let's just hypothetically imagine that the UK had that. I doubt you would have this problem with Islam, because there are so many people that they might be afraid to say things publicly, but then in unison, if as people, as citizens and taxpayers, they said, well, I don't really like this. I mean, what would they do? No, instead, what a lot of these Islamists love is to take cover under this sort of representative democracy, to paint a false picture, because the public doesn't have a direct influence. Not really. So you can express your views all you want, and maybe people will agree with you, and I can too, but ultimately it's the politicians who are pulling the strings. And so, we talked about this before, I don't want to get up, but, as someone who's somewhat familiar with guns, we talked about the distinction between the U.S. and say, the U.K., and I'm fairly convinced now that a lot of the reasons why you don't have the same level of extremism with regards to Islam in the States is that people are armed to the teeth and packing, quite frankly. There are other elements. I think the American identity is sort of kind of a thing that unites more people than British identity. Maybe Americans are more nationalistic. I don't know. But, I mean, hypothetically.
I think it's that Americans have more of a sense of American culture. Now, even though American culture is a kind of a misnomer, because inevitably with a country that large, you have hundreds of quite distinct cultures within that area. But they do have some sense of Americanism. Like you can drive pretty much anywhere in America and you will see American flags hanging. People, rightly or wrongly, do the Pledge of Allegiance however many times. There is a sense of Americanism, rightly or wrongly, and we have none of that in the UK.
Yeah,
it's been completely ripped out and gutted to the point where even if you're
a legacy of British imperialism, probably that the same is true of Germany and a lot. I mean, whether you agree with national pride or not, that's a separate issue, and I think my viewers know my views on national pride. But the fact that it's not allowed to, at least in practice, it's not allowed to be expressed, is a bit silly. And then, of course, it's relegated to people like the BNP or whatever, people, groups that maybe people wouldn't want to mix with. So, yeah, I think in the States it is different. You have that. And once again, I think the fact that so much of the citizenry is armed to the teeth, whether that's a good or bad thing from your point of view as a European, that is a deterrent as well. I guarantee if we had, if an incident such as the one you described with the guy who got stabbed, you probably would have some lunatic Christian militia, breaking out an AR-15 and Glocks and just, it wouldn't necessarily be a good thing per se, but I just don't see that in Europe. Europeans are far more passive, and this is why I think there's a long-term potential for real violence that would be very unpleasant. And I think the concerns are warranted. But I don't do you see any hope for your country?
Well, the cynic in me says no, just abandon ship, go somewhere else. But no, I think there can be a way back, but it's going to be a very, very careful line to tread. I think actually some sort of national pride is needed. And when I say that, I don't mean we need to go to the full, I'm British, therefore we're amazing, or I'm German, so I'm amazing, and so on and so forth. What I think we need to do is to have a sort of national pride that prioritizes culture over identity, because nationalism based on birthplace, I think, is stupid, because it's an arbitrary qualifier. It serves no real purpose. A culturalism, if you could call it that, would be celebrating the aspects of your culture that work, celebrating aspects of your culture that make it good and that make it function. Now, obviously, in Europe, there is a culture. There is a very distinct sort of European culture, and it varies down to the country level and then varies down to the local level. And these are things which I think need to be celebrated a lot more. People need to look at the culture that they are a part of. They need to integrate into that if they're an outsider. And then they need to work within that culture to move that culture forward towards not necessarily an objective end, because there is no objective end for culture. Culture goes on, well, it goes on for as long as humanity goes on. But moving it towards, or moving it in a direction that is well-informed, well-educated, and that makes objective, rational, best decisions, or as objective or rational, decent decisions as we can in regards to scientific development, technological development, medical development, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I would largely agree with that, but that if that could be implemented, that would be great. But the
important thing there is we remove the racial element entirely.
Yeah,
which I think is
the
biggest problem. This is the biggest problem. This is why I don't like sort of the nationalism element of these things, because it looks too much at what I think is the wrong cause. It basically says if you are of this color or of this country, then this is your culture, and therefore you are either my friend or my enemy, and that's wrong. What you need to be looking at is, do you hold the same values as I do? Great, welcome in. You don't?
No, that's my approach as well. I don't really care where someone's from. I care if they value science and evolution and trying to understand the human condition and freedom of speech and things like that. You can be purple, yellow, green. I don't really care. as long as you value those things. And to the extent that you don't, I'm probably not going to get along with you, whatever your skin color might be. So I think it should be that simple. But once again, this kind of faux diversity. Everyone's diverse. Everyone. I think I agree with you. Maybe a good term, I'm just making this up on the spot, would be cultural unilateralism in a country. Would that be a good idea, do you think?
It seems about right. Just this idea that, no, there is a distinct culture within here, and that is it. You are on this bar with this culture, or you're not.
Yeah. I'd totally be on the same page as that. But once again, look at the stuff you have to push past in order to even to get there. I just don't know how in mainstream politics.
The problem is we have the echo of imperialism to deal with. This is something which we're not going to get rid of, I don't think, as long as we have the regressive leftists using like British imperialism, American imperialism, French imperialism, and so on and so forth. And this is a very important difference. This is a very big distinction that I want to make here. I am all in favor of one culture existing in this regard, in sort of an area of land. The difference is, when you take the imperialistic approach, you force that culture out, regardless of what other people think, regardless of what they want. You can implement it forcefully in other countries, if need be. That I oppose. What you need is to have a culture that has a strong sense of identity, and that is so objectively good, people voluntarily come to it, and thus it expands peaceably. The problem is, when people that we see on the regressive left who oppose this idea of what they term white culture, which fucking ridiculous. Okay, all of these people are kind of this same hue. How many cultures are there? Well, there's fucking thousands of them. It's unavoidable. But they have in their mind, if you are pale enough and you have some degree of pride in your culture, then you must be an imperialist who wants to forcefully expand it. And that is the grand straw man that they will always concoct whenever you talk about this. No, we need not national pride, because that's ridiculous. That's, I'm born here, therefore proud of it. I'm this color, therefore I'm proud. That's ridiculous. You have a pride in your cultural values. You don't force it on people, but you make it just so good that they want to come to it by themselves anyway. It's not imperialist, it's not violent, but they will just say that it is, because that is a great way of painting you as a racist who wants segregation, even when all you're doing is saying, no, I don't want to force other people to it. I actively oppose people being forced to live in societies that they don't want. It's just, if you have this area of land that you are in, by all means, enact that in that area of land, and if people want to come to you, they will adapt to it. And that is, I think, the key difference that needs to be made here.
Yeah. I would largely subscribe to that. Yeah, I mean, frankly speaking, the whole imperialist, it doesn't really make sense when thugs, and particularly Muslim thugs, are attacking people in France, and it's all blamed on, some just purely socioeconomics, or, the French had North African colonies. It's getting a bit old. Most of these people don't have a connection to the colonialism. And in the UK, some of the most radical people are highly educated. Engineers, doctors, and so on and so forth. So that doesn't... I'm just wondering practically how we can push past this. I mean... I mean, all of this is sort of tied in, I guess, sort of to feminism, the sort of regressivism. There do seem to be mainstream forces cropping up. I mean, you're sort of in the mainstream. Sargon's definitely in the mainstream. He was recently interviewed by a guy named Dave Rubin, who is a former left-wing fanatic. So, it does seem to be making bits and pieces inroads, but I guess even if it is possible that it's a question of time. I mean, how much time do we have to make all of this work? And it's not at all clear. I think during this year, we almost certainly are going to get some other terrorist attack or some incident at least. And then it will get more and more frequent, I think, as time goes by. And the response to that is going to really be critical, I think, going forward.
Now, this is the sad thing where I have to, I suppose, confess the darker side of my mind, where I say, I want it to happen. I want there to be more events like Calais. I want there to be more public bombings, because that will make people fucking react. They're not going to otherwise. Because people are too content to follow the mainstream narrative of, oh, if you oppose it, you're a racist. It's necessary. At this point, it becomes necessary evil. And I hate that I have to say it. I despise that I have to say that.
Well, it's just look, when Cologne hit, everyone made a big deal of it because, as usual, women were affected. But that's kind of died down. Unfortunately, I said this on the stream last night with Sargon and the others, that in order for people to react in a massive way that isn't forgotten, you need a sort of a succession of events. And
rather sadly, we need not only a succession of events, but we need women to be the victims.
Oh well, yeah, you need the women.
And again, I hate saying that, but
look, it's not going to. We know if men are affected, it's not really a big deal.
Before we get called misogynists for the upbeat time.
Right. But I mean, it is effective. I mean, once the Cologne thing happened, you'd even see Americans talking about heading out to Europe to protect the women folk. I hate to say it, but that sort of base male instinct to protect women, regardless of personal cost, I think it's a bit brutish and not very well thought out. But it's useful, I think, on some level. And if more events along those lines happen, and particularly women are affected, then something will happen. Although I did discuss with Coltrane this notion of intersectionality. So if you're a brown-skinned man in this sort of paradigm, you actually have more victim points than a white woman.
Yeah.
So
feminists went down that route after Cologne. It was terrifying to watch.
Yeah, exactly. So that kind of complicates things. But a couple of more events along the lines of Cologne. I'm not advocating this, by the way. I'm just saying that I don't think we're going to see a reaction of the sort we need unless more negative events happen. That's just the way it is, the way I see it. So more events, more women being affected, and we might have a response by the politicians, because women are always in Western countries, the majority voting bloc, and they tend to vote with visceral emotion. So if they think a politician's going to promise some safety, they'll probably vote for him. So
yeah. I don't suppose you saw, I guess we're getting a bit off track from Britain, which is supposed to be the topic here. I don't suppose you saw the women who responded to Cologne, the feminist women who actually walked around with signs saying, "We would rather have rapists than racists."
This was,
These women who are like, if you see us being raped by a brown man, don't stop him, because we would rather have brown rapists than white men protecting white women, because that instantly makes them racist, rather than just making them human and saying, why the fuck are you raping that person? What's wrong with you?
There were some Swedish feminists who had an article about this as well. And it's all this, I don't really follow it in great detail. There's all this intersectionality, who has more victim points, that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, these people are crazy. And I think when practical, when women who aren't aligned, at least ideologically, with feminism, but still follow the gynocentric mandate, complain enough, men will respond. Oh, there was that young girl, 16 years old in Germany, who had a very sort of emotional, it was just kind of, I had trouble listening to it. It was just, please help us, protect us kind of thing. You get enough of that, and men are going to want to take action or take arms. That's just, male instinct, protector, provider instinct, most of them at least. And I think, that's basically what's going to take, unfortunately. But the feminists eventually will just be ignored, because when enough non-declared feminist women feel affected and feel like their security and safety is being threatened, they'll appeal to politicians and men to protect them, and they won't listen to the feminists anymore.
Yeah. They will vote in the biggest silverback male that they can. The one who says, I'm going to protect you the loudest.
Pretty much. I mean, I've seen absurdly funny comments. Americans commenting on the events, and then I think it was a European woman claiming that European men have been pussified and don't know how to protect their women anymore, and all this stuff like that. And for the record, guys, everyone knows I don't owe any. I have no obligation, in my view, to protect women merely because they have vaginas. I'll protect people I care about, my friends, man, woman, whatever. I don't really care about the details of the genitals and other factors. But most people don't operate along those lines, and I think ultimately it's kind of in this case, a useful evolved behavior, because maybe we will crack down on Islam and mass immigration if enough women are affected,
It's quite sad that we have to start thinking like that. And unfortunately...
Well, but the thing is, most of us are not, most people aren't like you. They're not, scientists or not critical thinkers. They just go with their instincts. And the typical male instinct is to just throw yourself in front of a woman to protect her because, well, that's just the way it is. And, that I don't see that. That's not going to change. So if we're going to work with human dynamics to change things, you have to work with the dynamics that are present. And that's gynocentrism will absolutely be the driving force, I think, if there's change in Europe. If enough women complain, politicians and men will respond, and then we'll have change. But the women, unfortunately, need to be directly affected. They need to have their freedoms impinged on. And I don't see any other way forward, frankly speaking. I think gynocentrism is going to be the key forward. It sounds crazy, to stopping mass immigration and the problem of Islam. Crazy, but...
No, it will be, because once enough women complain about it, things get done. The thing is, what we're going to see is, are we going to go full patriarchy mode, though? Because, I know we hear this word patriarchy thrown around willy-nilly all the time these days, so it's lost all meaning. But as we mentioned earlier, we know that Islam is very sort of... men hold all the power because they also hold all the responsibility.
Absolutely.
And that is born of gynocentrism. Are we then going to start having something like that in Europe as a response to? Are we eventually going to end up with this arms race of, we need men to defend the women against their men who are defending their women? Because...
I think so, because... As ideologically driven as some women might be, or whatever philosophies they might hold, I think one of the primary human female imperatives is safety and security. So it's just a fact. I think most women would drop their ideology if their lives are on the line or threaten to get raped, and probably would ultimately fall into some legitimate patriarchal order just so they could survive and reproduce. This is just the way history's always been, pretty much. They're all talk until the times get hard, in which case they're very flexible. I've talked about this, by the way. There's a concept called war brides. I forgot the name of the video. This is years old. I basically talked about the women during the Nazi era who, and particularly in France, who just, the minute the victors emerged, they showed not a shred of nationalism or defense of their fellow citizens. They just, a lot of them, just headed over to the Nazi victors, reproduced with them, and then after the fact, after the Allies had conquered back France, all the male traitors were executed, and the women faced the horrific punishment of having their hair cut. So, yeah, I just think that's the way it works. Men are just usually killed on the spot, and women can join the other side to survive. And so we're going a bit off topic here, but that's kind of how it works usually.
That's basic tribalism from the ape days. It's somewhat unavoidable.
Yeah, and we're stuck. I think this is a thing. One of the reasons I have people ask me, what is your issue with Sargon? My issue with Sargon is largely that he just ignores certain biological realities. I mean, he's a bit of an idealist, I think, and people aren't motivated by idealism most of the time. At the end of the day, they're motivated by their gut instincts, their evolved behavior as the human ape. So I think you're spot on by suggesting that we need women to be affected to push change. But this has always been historically attested. Gerwitz did a video years back where she talked about changes in safety regulations in Canada. How did they come about? Because a bunch of women were affected. Never mind the 90% plus of the men who are having their hands chopped off in the factory and dying on work at the work spot. But it's just that's what we need, unfortunately. But so you're caught between a rock and a hard place, right? You can say, well, I don't hope for bad things to happen to people, but unless bad things happen, nothing's going to change,
Yeah, everything needs an impetus. And unfortunately, this seems to be the only one left that will actually work, because any conversation, any rational attempt, going back actually on the topic of what we were saying earlier, where it's, well, no, if we control this immigration, attempt to control culture and actually make things work like this, that conversation gets shut down immediately. Therefore, the only response that is left is for some sort of more extremist action, and the more towards an extreme you go, the likelihood of violence happening approaches zero.
Yeah, and I think, I hate to talked about but I think neither Teal nor I, that's the whole point, we don't want bad things to happen. This is, I think we're both faced in talking about this with a kind of pessimistic view that's born in reality, that we just see our surroundings and just don't think there's any other option. I don't want man or woman to be, violently aggressed upon or anything like that, but nobody is talking sense in the public sphere. So I just don't know what's going to happen. I don't want this stuff to happen. I don't want, fascism to rise in Europe. All of these things, but we're all heading in that direction. And until there's some common sense in the political sphere, the mainstream political sphere, which you don't see any of, it's absolutely hopeless. And so the only response you'll get is if, there's some more bullshit happening with lots of women being affected, and it's sad. But I think we're just calling it as we see it. The respects to just leaving. If things get a lot worse, I've said, I'll just go back. I'll go to Hungary. Hungary has a population of, I think, 24 Muslims, and Hungarians aren't too, shy about expressing their dislike of Islam. So, maybe that's a bad thing, maybe it's not, but it's useful. So,
we dislike the idea, but not the people. Again, the key difference.
Well, I don't know. Hungarians are pretty xenophobic, to be fair, but once again, it's a useful tool, whether I agree with their xenophobia or not. I wouldn't feel comfortable walking around with a black friend in most Hungarian places.
Yeah, fair enough. It is kind of a sad state of affairs where we have to look at the darker side of human nature and say, well, you know what, xenophobia can actually be a really useful tool sometimes.
Yeah, it's terrible, but it's just, that's the reason why Eastern Europe in particular, I don't want to go talk too much about it as we draw to a close, but they have a different history. The communism before that, they were always aggressed upon by the East. People cite Vienna, 1683, the Ottoman. They've been through a lot more shit in some ways, a lot more sort of direct assaults. And over time, they've kind of developed a thick skin, and they tend to be overall pretty xenophobic. I don't think it's the same as racism per se, but they're xenophobic and they don't like outsiders. And I was talking to a Hungarian guy I know the other day, and he said, it's not, if people don't want to adapt, we just don't like them. So I guess that's useful. Yeah, it's all these dark aspects of human nature.
I think we come down to an inescapable fact about humanity, and something that people do not want to recognize, I think. Culture is necessary, and cultures cannot coexist.
I agree. And I think that, as a final note, perhaps, that people worry about the loss of the native culture or what have you. That's always a question of degrees. But ultimately, yes, I think if you're going to subscribe to what I would describe as before as sort of a cultural unilateralism, you're going to have to do that. If you think Islamic culture is more important than British or American or German or Dutch culture, you don't really belong there, frankly speaking.
Yeah, there are cultures where those values are upheld. Feel free to join them.
Yeah, you can head to Pakistan. I have a friend who unfortunately could only find work in Islamabad. He's German. I'm still worried about him, and it doesn't look good over there. You can head to maybe you like Saudi Arabia. It's lots of Islam there. So generally, I think there are a lot of places where people would appreciate your views, just not in Europe. So that's the thing.
Yeah. And again, notice the racism here that we're saying these cultures are absolutely free to exist. Yeah. Clearly the thoughts of some racists there.
Well, I guess they would say it's racist, or imperialist, because we're saying that the cultures cannot coexist in the same context, and I think that's true. But have them exist in their own context. Yeah. It's always puzzling to me, as I sort of just blather on here, that why all these Muslims are coming to Europe. they come from great Muslim societies. By and large, why? I mean, if Pakistan's so great, why head to the UK?
It's because they want the technological benefits of being in a non-Islamic nation with what they perceive as the benefits of being in an Islamic nation. And then we have to start looking at it and saying, well, is there something about these cultures that has led to their development? Because as we all know, culture is inextricably linked to biology. Does that mean that there may be certain things to do with that culture that then lead inevitably almost to certain levels of technology being developed?
Well, I mean, you look at something like evolution, which is the foundation of all biological science and indeed medicine. As far as I know, no mainstream person subscribing to Islam they don't endorse that. I mean, they think it's just a bunch of bunk or bullshit. I mean, how can you do medical research or any of it without believing in evolution, for example? You know. So, I suppose you could. I have a friend. His brother is a evangelical Christian, and he's also a doctor. So I guess if you just only concentrate on the anatomical and don't ignore the origins of things, the etiology specifically, then yeah, I mean, I guess you can do it sort of. But I think there's a reason why the West is a better prospect in terms of development and technology and science than places like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. But hey, that's just my opinion.
Now, there is definitely a reason why Western culture and Far Eastern culture developed more technologically than any other cultures. Is anyone going to be brave enough to plumb the reasons why? Only time will tell.
It's complicated, but that's the thing. We can't even have a public discussion about this. But by saying, for example, that Far Eastern culture and Western culture are technologically, scientifically, and culturally more advanced than, say, Islamic culture, your standard Middle Eastern culture, or Pakistani culture, that in itself is viewed as sort of an aggression and is imperialist and all this other crap that you hear from the left all the time. So, you know,
so the great imperial straw man again. So you're saying two cultures can exist separately from each other. That means you must be saying one needs to subvert the other. Nope. Okay.
Yeah, and I think it's an open-ended question. There might be some genetic factors, maybe not. But we can't even talk about it. So there's so many things in public discourse that we cannot talk about because you as an individual have to fear, at least in the West, for your unemployment or getting sacked or something like that. And in particular, if you insult, I mean, I'll give a final as we drive, so we're just kind of drawing this out. Those of you who didn't watch the live stream, it was a really shitty live stream. It was online with a bunch of people, but I pointed out that in the early 2000s, there was a German scholar who was an expert in Semitic languages, particularly Aramaic and Syriac and Arabic. He published, sort of a very academic piece analyzing some of the contents of the Quran, particularly the part where they talk about the reward of 72 virgins. And he had added and suggested that much of the Quran is built upon earlier sources from other sources, not necessarily in Arabic. He said, well, in Syriac, all this stuff means white raisins in particular, as a sort of delicacy. So the idea is that you're rewarded with white raisins next to your family instead of 72 virgins. Now, he published this, and he was forced into hiding. So this is another issue with Islam I think I should bring up, is that Western scholars have no right, according to Islamists, to study these texts and say anything that is perceived as negative, because he made the suggestion, how dare you criticize, we're going to threaten your life. This is another problem. But maybe more Western non-secular scholars looking at the Quran, its contents and its origins would be really helpful in sort of disarming the Quran of its authority. But if you do that, your life is under threat, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's kind of terrifying. Well, I've got to admit, I think I prefer his interpretation. You have all eternity. It's like, would I rather have 72 women or a bowl of raisins? I pick the raisins.
Well, yeah. I mean, you have to imagine that once you deflower the women and what you're wed to them, you have all these other responsibilities. I can't imagine it be that pleasant, but yeah.
Olive raisins, on the other hand, that's always nice.
Yeah. I mean, and it's not even I'm not a scholar in this area, but I mean the real area of interest here is that here was a Western scholar, a German guy, trying to publish something, but he's kind of had to go into hiding. The interview was done. He was blacked out. I mean, this is the response coming from the Islamic world, and frankly speaking, once again, the moderates don't speak out against it. And every time I talk about that, I have this one guy on I guess he's MGTOW, but he's very much Muslim, criticizing me. He says it all has to do with foreign policy, it has nothing to do with Islam, blah, blah, blah. And then he talks about various historical periods where Islam was great and preserving the knowledge of the Greeks. And I just say, we're talking about now. It doesn't help us, whatever happened 800 or 900 years ago, that doesn't help us. And I've said before, if we were talking about Christianity in the 14th century, I would be probably no more concerned about Christianity in Europe, but we're not. So, anyway, any final thoughts you'd like to add before we?
No, I think that's pretty much it. I think we did get a little derailed from British stuff, but as it's part of the EU, you can't really separate it from that overarching conversation about all of these things. Until the EU fragments, you've got to take each country individually, but when you pull it out of the pile, it comes with all this other stuff tied to it. So no, I think we've had a good one.
Excellent. Well, everyone, thanks for listening. I mean, Thiele is a legend, so you probably all know him. And I hope some more mainstream people listen to you on this too, because unfortunately, you're constrained by the nature of your audience sometimes to only cover feminist-related subjects, which are certainly laudable and worth doing, but there are other topics that need addressing as well. So I'm happy to give you a platform here to talk about these things.
It's nice to stretch the legs of the mind a little bit.
Absolutely. All right, guys. Thanks for listening. And Teardale will check you out later, and I will check you out later as well. And everyone take care.